Art school? Pfft, more like Vincent van Gogh, one of the most influential and complicated artists of the modern era. But what inspires me about him isn't the tragedy of his life, nor the years spent painting almost to the exclusion of anything else, nor even that one Doctor Who episode that he was in, you know the one. No. What really inspires me about him is that he didn't shell out thousands of dollars to attend a private institution to attain a degree in 4 years when it could have easily been gotten in 2 with less money. But, also, could you imagine Van Gogh as, a modern art school boy? He's definitely giving sensitive, emo, soft boy artist vibes and, kind of mysterious, but you should definitely also stay away from him because he, allegedly sent pieces of his ear to his ex-girlfriend. And also unwarranted pics, but, it was kind of manipulated in a way that it's kind of art now. God, it's been, 2 months, and I've already forgotten how to make videos like this again. But, well, okay, here. It is a new year, and I know I was gone last month, but between work and the holidays, I just needed a little break. But with the break comes time for reflection. And as I get further away from college and graduation, I'm thinking back a lot on my time as an art student, more specifically as an animation major, and how hard it is to really encapsulate all of that, those experiences and those opinions into words. So watch me try to describe those feelings in words in about 20 minutes or less. No, but I've been wanting to make an art school video for a long time, as soon as I was accepted 4-ish years ago, long time. And then, especially after this sort of art school reckoning that happened in 2020, if anyone remembers that. But eventually I thought it'd be better to wait a few months after graduation, after the dust, or I guess pencil shavings, have settled, so I can approach my experience and the whole of the art school conversation really with the benefit of the relative distance of time. I mean, I did graduate over 6 months ago, but not make this so late that my feelings of during those last 4 years are too obscured. And while I can only really go in depth about my experience at a specific school, which I won't name in this video, even though I had it plastered all over my social media account for years, so you'll be able to guess which one fairly quickly. I do think that there is some overlap in the way that art colleges, and let's be real, most private US colleges run, and what they can positively offer students, as well as the drawbacks of attending one for current students and alums. So I will be speaking a little bit to the business and culture of that, as well as the overlap in the art and animation school environments throughout this video. But before we get into all of that, if you're new here, hey, feel free to check out my previous videos after watching this one, of course. I kind of see this channel as a sort of grab bag of various topics that I want to cover, so hopefully you'll find other content on this channel that interests you as well. And if you're returning, hey, hello, welcome. Always a pleasure to see you again. I hope you all find this video interesting, especially if you're someone looking to go to an art school in the future. I was inspired to make this video in part due to Izzy's video on the topic about a year or so ago, and some of the heavier stuffs that they cover I will also cover later on. And by the way, you should definitely check out that art school video. And also partly by me wanting to air out my personal experiences and grievances in the hopes that it helps someone be a little bit more informed on the culture and the business and just different sides to what it means to go to an art college than I was as a 17, 18-year-old. Oh, and let me know if you have or are planning to go to an art school in the comments. I'd be really interested to see all of your takes or opinions on that sort of experience. But with all that said, let's get into it. So I thought about getting all sappy in this section. The reason I wanted to go to an art school was because I've been drawing ever since I could hold a pencil, which granted is true. Or that I never fit in at school because my mind was quirky and my overactive imagination was a lot for peers my age to handle. And I wanted to be surrounded by like-minded individuals, which I guess is also true, although very not like other kids. Well, but the long and short of it is I wanted to be an animator. I wanted to work in the animation industry, and I didn't really see a path for myself forward unless I went to an art college. Of course, at that time, I heard of people getting hired off of Tumblr or Twitter because they posted great art consistently, but I knew that even though I was working really hard to improve on my technical skills that something like that was probably not in the cards for me. That said, my plan was never to attend for the full 4 years. Obviously, I was hoping to get scouted in year 2 and avoid having to take out loans for the latter half of that education. Well, that never ended up happening, but that dream alone was enough to propel me through the application and entrance process and land on a school that, well, honestly not my first pick, truthfully was pretty well known in animation circles, plus I got to move to the big city and live out my semi-independent artist dreams. But going back to that sort of thinking, the idea that my career wouldn't jumpstart without a formal art education or degree was something that I saw perpetuated a lot by these art colleges, or at the very least, that was my perspective of it at the time. And what I want to discuss a little bit first on the business end of this. And I know, of course, these colleges are making it seem like attending an art school is an essential part of the amateur artist to seasoned professional animator artist pipeline. And for a lot of these schools, I'll give them credit. They actually had the impressive student work and alumni to back this perspective they were pushing. And it seems like a lot of this business model, it being the primary method of recruiting new students, of course, was selling a vision or a promise that going to the school would essentially mold you into a better artist and you'd get hired by Disney the second you graduate. And I know that all sounds pretty unrealistic and a pretty tough sell if you're not as naive as I was, but that's how they sold it to me, and I bought it, or at least partially bought it. I never thought that being a working artist was a walk in the park and that new gigs were exceptionally easy to come by, but I had no other connections to the art world as many other people who were looking to go to an art school, and if going to the right school was what it took to get a leg up, I was going to do just that. But that leg up, the promise that it would help you go further in the industry, that was what I was sold on. But if you look at the realities of promises like this, it comes at a very expensive and at times mentally taxing cost. So let's move on from these promises to the realities of what I actually experienced and learned as an art student. This will definitely be the longest section of this video, so to organize it just a little bit, I'm splitting this section into the pros and cons of what I have experienced and learned about the culture, inner workings, and overlap of the art and animation school experience. And because the cons get pretty serious and heavy later on, I will start with the pros first, or the good things that going to an art college provided me and other people that I've talked to. So the first pro, and it's a pretty good one, so a really good pro of going to an art college for me was that going to an art school gave me greater access to resources that I had never had, some of which were covered under tuition. The first of which I can think of were figure and gesture drawing classes, at least in drawing intensive majors. I know that other art majors may vary in what resources they offer, but again, I was an animation major, so figure drawing classes. I know that this was pretty big for me because prior to school, I had never taken a life drawing class due to lack of access and distance, so I'm still pretty grateful for that, though I will mention that figure drawing classes definitely exist outside of art schools, so if there are any available sessions or classes near you, definitely take advantage of that. But there were also other resources like art and animation computer programs. Like animation major, for example, we got access to industry standard programs like Toon Boom Harmony and Storyboard Pro, and later access to the Adobe Suite, which I'm only a little bit miffed about, but only because of the circumstances and the timing, because that didn't kick in until the later half of my time as a student, and I was still on an annual subscription that I purchased earlier, and I still had to write it out, but after all that, it was really nice to not have to pay an additional cost to use it for assignments and personal projects. But I do know that not all schools cover animation programs like that, so make sure you do your homework and your research on which schools and programs do. But for stuff that wasn't covered, like traditional art supplies, while still a bummer to shell out cash that you might not readily have had available to purchase non-essentials, we usually got some supplies with no extra cost from our professors, and some pretty good product recommendations too, with some of those materials being relatively inexpensive for what you needed, though definitely not always. And I think art schools across the board generally also give access to art studio spaces, which means that we got a lot of freedom to collaborate with peers or to take time to experiment with different traditional mediums and spaces designed to encourage that. A perk of being an animation major at the school I attended was access to the Cintiq labs, where we were allowed time to work on Cintiqs outside of class and well into the night if you really wanted to work on assignments and, again, personal stuff. We were also allowed to check out certain equipment for use at home or at the dorms, and that really helped if you were planning on spending a weekend or even a week away from the facilities. So another good pro about going to an art school is being able to connect and be taught by professors who are still actively working in whatever your desired industry is. And this is great because depending on the teacher, you're likely to get some up-to-date tips and tricks about different equipment, portfolio reviews, what to expect at jobs, and if you make a good enough impression, they can give you a recommendation for jobs or work after graduation. So you may very well end up working as a peer with someone who just taught you. So this is probably the main reason why you're considering going to an art school, outside of developing your technical and specialized skills, of course. The main thing that we hear in pretty much every industry is it's not what you know, it's who you know. And for anyone else who has some form of anxiety with communicating with others, this might be hard to work out. But I know that this phrase, in my admittedly very limited experience, pretty much holds to be true. But the good thing about going to an art school is that most people are just as eager as you to make friends and collaborate and just talk about art and non-art related stuff. And if you hit it off with other people well enough, you'll be lucky to have made some long-lasting friendships that will really come in handy if you're looking for your next gig outside of school, turbulent economy willing. Also, I've learned that most job postings, at least within the art and animation industry side of it, are usually filled or intended for specific people. So at times, leveraging these connections will be your best bet at getting your foot in the door. Okay, so with those admittedly very few pros out of the way, we can get into some of the more negative aspects that I felt while attending an art school. Though I feel like it's worth mentioning here that I wrote up my own thread of cons a while back on Twitter, and some of what I mentioned here will have been covered or pulled from what I said there. So if you're at all interested in a less structured and more informal take from me on that, I will link that in the description below. And like I said before, some of these later parts will get pretty heavy, so I'll give content warnings for those topics when we get there. Hey, so you know how I mentioned those connections earlier? Well, there is another side to that. I felt like through my time at the school that while I was grateful to have made the friends that I did, there was this sense of competition that permeated this sort of atmosphere. And I know that for whatever industry, knowing that you'll likely have to compete with peers for jobs post-graduation is a daily reality and an inevitability for people. So I guess this isn't as much of a con as a thing you'll realize pretty quickly, especially around internship season. And as much good and collaborative friendships can be formed during school, there's also some cliquey behavior that I've noticed mostly during my first year, as well as falling out between friends and even instances of bullying, in part because of that aforementioned cliquiness and competition. It made it hard for me to reach out to people during my first semester, as I never knew who was cool with who. Though all that mostly eased up during my second year and beyond, it definitely got a lot easier to tell the sort of people that you wanted to associate with and hang out with. And you know, I guess all that's fairly normal, aside from the bullying, of course. Not gonna advocate for that at all here, but really something to acknowledge, as most people in their first year of art school are fresh out of high school, and there are some social growing pains, especially as delightfully awkward and introverted as many artists are, that you really have to get through before really solidifying who you want to interact and work with long term. The sense of competition also extended outwards sometimes towards other schools. I think earlier in my time at the school, we had the old department head that was more interested in pushing a rivalry between the school that I attended and a certain school out in California than actually improving the two departments he was in charge of. Thankfully, he was replaced a couple times actually, but man, is that a story for another video if you're at all interested. And the sentiment definitely dropped after his time. If anything, I wish that we had more of an opportunity to connect with people from other schools, hell, even other majors. I think there's a kind of isolation that we had from other majors at the school I attended, and I just wish that sort of collaboration was pushed just a little bit more, especially to get my introverted ass out of my shell and to collaborate and to discover different mediums and different art forms. I think that definitely should have been pushed a bit more. So, tough or increased expectations. So some of the things that you had to quickly get used to as an art student was increased and sometimes unrealistic expectations that the curriculum put on students. I know that part of this based on what professor or class that you took, but even regardless of that, this pressure really sort of permeated art school, I guess, because we haven't completely left behind the idea of these starving and struggling artists who overcome stress and adversity to create better art. This largely has to do with crunch culture being the norm as an art student, and overnighting or spending the night at school facilities to work on assignment was also, again, a bit of a norm and sometimes an inevitability, depending on how good you were at making time in your schedule for work and other things. And I definitely felt this pressure myself because I usually had multiple classes that I had to juggle in order to keep my full-time student status intact. And while I was able to manage all of that pretty all right, there were a couple times I got some poor marks because I just didn't have the time to render out full-scale illustrations and bang out essays for elective classes at the same time. I knew about other people where the intensity of their schedules, and in addition to jobs they would have to take to afford tuition, plus the really weirdly strict attendance policy that we had, it really just broke them. So sometimes you'd have really talented people dropping out, which in part led to our higher dropout rates, to make art on their own terms, or others leaving art entirely as their passion for it was just drained by attending an art institution. So content warning for this last bit of the section in regards to death and while I never heard of this being a problem specific to the school that I attended, I do know that at certain other schools that they were pretty infamous for a few students choosing to end their own lives due to the stress and lack of accommodations for their mental health. Again, I never went to these schools where this happens, so I can't put the blame on these institutions entirely, but more intense cases like that shouldn't be ignored when we discuss the culture of overworking and fairly poor mental accommodations for students that I've heard from former and current art students. Also, I wanted to mention that for the first few years that I was in school, the slogan for the animation department was "Animate or Die," which is a pretty out there phrase, but granted, it was changed about halfway through my time at the school, so there's definitely a sort of shift, crunch culture perspective that is slowly changing. I think part of the initial problem that I had with meeting people during my first year, outside of the clickiness and the competition atmosphere, was the lack of diversity that I encountered. There just really wasn't, and kind of still isn't, a lot of people who looked like me that attended the school. I noticed that the percentage of students who were Black at the school had dropped from 7% to 4% after just one graduating class during my first year. And I think this problem, this lack of diversity, really manifests in the way that we, the Black and brown students, conversed and related to our majority white peers and professors and the institution as a whole. I heard from one friend that there was a story of this particular non-Black teacher, saying the N slur while reciting a quote without much consideration for the feelings of students present. And unfortunately, this isn't the only controversy involving the N slur. There is, at my school, the sort of infamous whiteboard incident that happened just before COVID hit, where during Black History Month, students were encouraged to write out the names of celebrities or influencers or just influential Black people on a whiteboard in the library, and someone wrote out the N slur, and the school sent out a pretty lukewarm email regarding it without any intention of following up or following through with this. It was pretty indicative of the treatment and the seriousness of problems that Black and brown people faced at that school. And there wasn't really any acknowledgement for the larger community until 2020. And really, they only sent out these lists of emails and diversity and inclusion stuff during 2020 because to not have spoken up at all about what was happening to Black and brown and Asian students then would have likely been detrimental to branding rather than the sort of genuine care and interest, at least that I felt on my part. A lot of the way that this manifests is the lack of art from people of color that are featured in the curriculum. I know that as an animation major, the majority of Western animation and aesthetics that were taught to me were those that were focused primarily on those from white artists. And in order to sort of break away from that sort of Eurocentric aesthetic that you were learning, you had to specifically go out and look for African art classes. Otherwise, you'd be left with a very whitewashed curriculum. And that's what I did. I took African art classes to sort of learn about ways of making art that were different than the ones that we were always taught. And I know for some people, this whole diversity thing isn't a big problem as some of the others on this list, but if you're someone like me, then that's really something that you should know about. And I think that it's also, I can't pull out percentages for other schools, but I feel like that sort of makeup of people of color to white peers also faces a similar challenge. Sorry, there's a squirrel that was scurrying across my window, and I don't know, I just started thinking about squirrels don't have to worry about going to school, much less art school. They just could go, they just scurry around and they just go collect nuts, and they don't have to worry about having to work 2 to 3 jobs to afford rent and student loan payments. And it's just how nice is it to be a squirrel? You don't have to do all that just to fend for your little squirrel babies and your squirrel wife and children. That the Spider-Man villain, Dr. Connors, who just really wanted to turn people into big old lizards. What if we just did that and just turned everyone into squirrels? I wouldn't mind being a squirrel, I guess, and not have to worry about what my next hustle is and how I'm going to eat. All I have to eat is nuts as a squirrel, nuts and berries. And maybe if I did want to go to school, I could just go study nuts and berryology as a squirrel. Wouldn't that be nice? To be a squirrel. Okay, back to the video. So I think probably one of the biggest cons of going to an art institution is definitely the cost of admission. Attending a 4-year art college could end up having you shell out well over $100,000, even with financial aid. And because most people, like myself, don't have money like that readily available, that directly translates to being in debt by that amount. And I think this is one of the biggest problems alone that contribute to the aforementioned cons, like the high dropout rates, lack of diversity, other problems, because it's a barrier of entry for many middle to lower class people who are unable to afford such a steep price and are unwilling to sign their lives away to essentially become a debt slave just because they wanted an academic backing to support a career that they have passion and drive for. In some ways, I kind of wish that I had resisted a bit more, looked into alternative options instead of taking on high-interest predatory loans. But this, I guess, is my normal now, and until we can get effective leadership that'll effectively make protections against letting young 17 to 18-year-olds borrow huge sums of money or cancel all loans is kind of the reality that people like myself are living with. So that's fun. But another aspect to this cost is that it isn't anywhere near equivalent to the average starting salary that a person would make immediately leaving school as an artist. Most artists, like myself, don't leave college to start selling pieces in big art galleries for thousands of dollars. We either work starting positions at studios or take on multiple freelancing gigs to make a living. And if you're really strapped for cash or feel like doing either isn't enough to really sustain you, you do both, like me. And again, like, this cost of admission means that you're neglecting people from different backgrounds to really sort of broaden and expand the traditional art experience and art aesthetic. So it's really sad that it's locking out a lot of passionate and talented people from coming, because what we really need less of is just a bunch of rich kids who are fooling around and not taking their classes seriously, but they're able to still attend because they have the money to be reckless with it, rather than people who are really like struggling or have to take on 2 to 3 jobs just to make ends meet and just feel like it's not worth it, you know? And I guess to sort of end this section, I'm not entirely, and I guess it should be worth mentioning that I'm not entirely blaming the school or the art school system for my choice to put myself in debt, but I will criticize the amount of money that they charge that always somehow increases every year. And, you know, I'm not some big financial analyst, but I just don't understand how you can be in charge of a school like that and look at the over 40 million people who are trapped in student loan debt and still decide that, yeah, charging $50,000 a year, and growing, of course, is a financially sound decision if eventually most people won't be willing to pay that much as art resources are increasingly becoming available for less money or just straight up for free. But I don't know. That's just me, in my unprofessional opinion. Also, sometimes the scholarships that certain schools give out are usually just barely enough to cover certain courses and are really the equivalent of like 10% off coupons. So if you really couldn't afford it, like me, make sure you get comfortable with your school's financial aid office, because you'll likely spend a lot of back and forth with them before coming up on some grants or any sort of relief. Also, another thing about the cost is like some of that money is going towards classes that aren't really essential. And like, I get being a well-rounded individual, but you know, I feel like if I'm paying this much, I feel like the majority of classes that I take should go towards things that are specific to my major or what I want to do, you know? And it feels weird to have to take these classes that most people aren't taking seriously, because again, like, these writing and other classes aren't of interest to them, and it just feels weird that so much money goes towards it. And another thing is, I keep adding more things, but another thing was like the whole online schooling thing, where they were like charging the same amount of money just for you to sit in your bedroom at home and go to school. Like this is a list of cons, but in that case, we were all getting conned. Even if you didn't go to an art school, you're getting conned by spending the same amount of money for tuition just to sit in your room. And I don't know that's all pandemic related, and I get it. There was no alternative for that. But to pay the same amount of money just to pay for your own internet and your own computer and your own drawing tablets and stuff so that you can finish work, I don't know. I didn't feel like that was worth it. What is an institution without its controversy? So, general content warning for abuse of power and harassment and a little bit of ableism, as well as other things that will be brought up later as they come, I suppose. But I think an issue at different art schools that definitely isn't, or I guess now wasn't, as more people are seeming to be more forthcoming about their experiences in recent years, especially to the public, is the nature of inappropriate or unfair relations between students and staff. And this can range from just the sort of general normal favoritism that professors may have towards certain students to straight up harassment. And at the school that I attended, there was this pretty long, around 20-something page document of a list of faculty members who had done something that had hurt or harmed a student without making any sort of atonements, to just straight up like really serious accusations of harassment and sexual harassment. I know that reading this document was really shocking, as well as really disappointing, as there were some names that I recognized on there that of professors that I thought were cool and fine that just turned out to be creepy, or just really made some really huge missteps in the way that they treated students on campus. There's this one name on there, it's pretty infamous for me specifically, because I had actually, worked with him directly as he taught me in whatever class. But his case was actually pretty extreme, because he would allegedly Photoshop students' heads on top of bikini models. He would make a whole lot of inappropriate comments and had inappropriate behavior towards students that he would talk to in the facilities. And actually the photoshopping people's heads is actually what got him kicked out of the facilities outside of teaching hours. But he would just go into the school library and just continue doing all that weird photoshopping thing. Allegedly. But it wasn't until people made a stink about it in 2020 that he was like officially kicked out. And that's like great and all, but the fact that he's had a history of doing stuff like this for well over a decade, and it took well over a decade to get him and his predatory ass away from current and future students, is kind of ridiculous. I know part of that was that people didn't feel comfortable making complaints, but stuff like this was pretty well known enough for the fact that he got kicked out of the facilities outside of teaching hours while I was there, and then kicked out again while I was there. Like that, that some of that needed to be addressed a lot earlier on. But there are also other cases, again, of ableism, about professors not respecting or making insensitive comments towards neurodivergent individuals. But it isn't just faculty who are guilty of being creepy and predatory towards students. Some of that harassment also comes from other students as well, and due to either their circumstances or being able to pay the ridiculous tuition on time, they maintain their standing at the school. They still remain students even though they've done things that were really wrong and might have warranted either suspension or complete expulsion from the school. And it was hard, especially for people who were victims in the situation, to talk about these incidents that happened, because talking about these situations openly, not even publicly, but to any higher ups, could often result in victims being dismissed, or the professor still retaining their job and then seeking to leverage whatever their connections or power, and have that student face sort of consequences, both either personally or career-wise. That's definitely something to keep in mind about whether or not you want to attend an art school, or sort of any school, but whether the sort of the history of controversy that the school that you're planning on attending has. So there it is. The whole video on my mostly coherent thoughts on what it was like to have attended an art school. And whether or not you should go to one. And while I think that making this video really helped get some of those really pent up feelings of mine out there, I do feel sort of mixed emotions about my time there still, both the good and the bad. But what I can say for sure, though, is if you're really interested in my opinion of whether or not an art school is really worth going to, I think I would say no. Okay, well, at least not as it is currently. I will admit there are a number of progressive social changes happening in response to that art school reckoning of 2020 and onward as a whole, but these changes take time to implement, time that you might not want to wait around for if you're eager to get your foot in the door. And with a number of art and animation resources and courses online that have expanded since even I was in high school, there's no way to justify the typical cost and structure of an institution when you can choose your courses in person, or even from the comfort of your own home, on whatever budget and cost is most comfortable for you. And as for whether or not I regret going or not, I would say I don't really regret it, which, okay, I know that's, it's really confusing. I just said that you shouldn't go to an art school. Why do I not regret my time going there? well, I just think in general, I'm a person who tries not to regret too many of my past decisions. Definitely look back and reflect on like, hey, maybe I shouldn't have done that. Like I definitely regret the amount of money that I took out and now owe to private lenders. But that outside of that, going to an art school is a very unique experience that you don't really get from traditional other colleges. And even still, it really depends on the location and the environment that you're in. And that's what makes it so unique and so special. And I wouldn't have traded the friends that I still have to have attended a college that costs less. And I know that that's not really realistic or logical, but I'm a dreamer. I'm an artist. So I don't really regret going, but if I could go back and tell myself to not go, I might have done that. Me now, here in the future, is just stuck with whatever I chose. And that's fine. That was a unique experience, and I think that I needed it for this timeline. So I'm making do with that. So yeah, I think this video, again, covers most of what I wanted to talk about. There are definitely stories and opinions that I left out in the interest of brevity and to just sort of make this flow a lot better. But if you guys are at all interested in those art school related stories and further opinions, just let me know and I will be more than happy to make a follow-up video. So again, I want to know, have you attended or are planning to attend an art school or art college in the future? If you have, do you have any stories? And if you're not, what encouraged that decision? I want to know all of that and whatever you guys have to say down in the comments. Feel free to follow my Twitter and Instagram, especially my Twitter if you want to see me yell into the void daily. I also have an INPRNT shop if you'd be interested in buying a print from me, as well as my Ko-fi with all those links to those good stuff down in the description below. But aside from that, I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day or evening or night or whatever time, space, lack of does time even exist where you are, whatever. Enjoy the moment that is happening right now. But as for me, I am currently very hungry. And I've been trying to finish the rest of this before the sun goes away on a very empty stomach. So I guess that makes me a literal starving artist. So I think that I will just go and bust out my gouache set and get some brushes and paper, and I will paint a bowl of fruit, and then I will eat and consume said painting. Goodbye.